Good morning, Hoot Nation. I'm Matt Donnelly, and this is your High Point Sports Week 15 Bengals review. When the week started, the Bengals were on the outside looking in when it came to the playoff picture. We were essentially that kid outside of the store there, looking through the window, just doing some window shopping. Well, Christmas, it came early as the Bengals took care of business against the Minnesota Vikings with a 27-24 overtime victory. Jake Browning, who was cut by the Vikings, took it personally and reminded them that perhaps they were premature in dismissing him. Since the NFL started tracking this back in 1950, only one quarterback has completed 75% of their passes and thrown for over 1,000 yards in their first 4 career starts. That man is Jake Browning. Browning once again came to play, throwing for 324 yards and a pair of scores, finishing with 22 fantasy points and a top 10 fantasy week at the quarterback position. Since week number 13, Browning has been averaging 23.4 fantasy points per game, and only Brock Purdy has been averaging more over that 3-week window. Bengals fans, Browning isn't Joe Burrow, and he isn't Boomer Esiason, but he is the first Bengals quarterback since Boomer back in 1984 to win 3 of his first 4 starts. As for the rest of this Bengals offense, they are averaging 31.7 points per game over the last 3 weeks, which sits only behind the Los Angeles Rams, the Miami Dolphins, and the San Francisco 49ers. And it has been a committee approach here in the jungle. Last week, 6 different Bengals had at least 45 yards of offense. Joe Mixon, 47 yards rushing on 10 carries, while adding 14 more yards on 3 receptions. He also managed to find the end zone and finish the day with 14 fantasy points, which put him as a high-end RB2 last week as far as fantasy is concerned. Chase Brown, on the other hand, he only finished with 7 fantasy points, but he has now seen at least a 25% snap share in 3 straight contests, and against the Vikings, he saw a season-high 31.8% of that snap share. He also ran the ball 7 times for 23 yards and caught 3 passes for 28 yards. T. Higgins was Browning's top fantasy target, hauling in 2 touchdown passes, including that game-tying touchdown score there with 48 seconds remaining. Higgins would go on to finish with 2 touchdowns, hauling in 4 of 8 targets for 61 yards and 22 fantasy points. Those 22 fantasy points would translate into a top 12 fantasy finish this week at the wide receiver position, which is something that we haven't been able to say for T. Higgins in quite some time. Jamar Chase finished with 64 yards himself, hauling in all 4 of his targets, but it wasn't the catches that we were talking about after the game. In fact, he did suffer an AC joint sprain, which could force him to miss some time as the Bengals continue their playoff push. The best case scenario, Chase is only somewhat limited. Think back to week number 4, Devontae Adams, when he had that AC joint sprain. But he could also miss a significant time there, looking back to Deebo Samuel, who missed 3 to 4 weeks there after a fracture was found. As of Sunday, Chase was too sore for an MRI, so we continue to wait. If Chase is to miss any time, then Tanner Hudson, who caught all 5 of his targets for 49 yards, and Tyler Boyd, who also had 53 yards receiving there on 2 catches, they're going to need to pick up that production moving forward. Chase wasn't the only Bengal there to suffer an injury on Saturday. The defense suffered a couple of big blows, including defensive tackle DJ Reader with that quad injury and defensive back DJ Ivey with an ACL, who were both lost for the season. The Reader injury is significant as the Bengals have allowed 1,796 rushing yards and 15 rushing touchdowns this season, not to mention 4.7 yards per attempt, which is the second most in the league. Losing Reader certainly does not help that, and they will need to find a way to stop the bleeding as Ty Chandler ran for 132 yards on 23 carries, which works out to 5.7 yards per attempt last week. One thing is for sure, Sam Hubbard and Trey Hendrickson are going to need to level up even more in the absence of Reader. And I'm not sure Hendrickson can do more, to be honest with you. Hendrickson had a sack and a half on Saturday to push his total to 15 this season. That is 1 behind TJ Watt for the NFL lead. This brings me on to another rant as to why nobody is talking about Trey Hendrickson as a premier pass rusher. We talk about TJ Watt as an all-pro, and rightfully so. Danielle Hunter there, Max Crosby, Josh Allen, Khalil Mack, Nick Bosa, Micah Parsons, and Myles Garrett. They're all getting love, but never do we hear Trey Hendrickson's name in the media. Going back to 2020, Hendrickson, He's had at least 13 sacks in 3 of the last 4 seasons there. His numbers are just as good, if not better, than Myles Garrett this season. In fact, he's got 1 more tackle and a sack and a half more than Garrett, who seems to be unanimously a first-team selection here so far. As for the rest of this run game, you know what, I'm going to digress right now. But as far as the rest of the run game is concerned in this defense, they have to step up. Jermaine Pratt had 12 tackles last week and a half a sack. And Logan Wilson is 15th when it comes to tackles this season. They're going to need to fill this gap for the Bengals to fill that void left behind by DJ Reader. Now, saying that, there was some big stops there on 3rd and 4th down for this Bengals team that kept them in the game to get them that win over the Vikings last week. So shout out to that Bengals defense that bent, but they did not break. Once again, they face a very difficult matchup here in week number 16 as they face the Pittsburgh Steelers, who won the original matchup there just a few weeks ago, which happened to be Jake Browning's first ever career start. A win this week would give the Cardiac Cats a little bit of breathing room when it comes to that playoff race as the regular season draws closer to an end.